Hello and welcome to the Brazilian BA Guest. It's a pleasure to have you here. If you are not subscribed to this channel yet, please do so right now. At YouTube, you can subscribe at the Brazilian BA. Just click on the bell so you'll be warned every time we have a new video. We are also on LinkedIn and join us, bring your questions. Today, I have a very good guest directly from South Africa, Miss Sonja Blignaut. Thank you for coming, Sonja.
Thank you for inviting me, Fabrizio.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here, Sonja. You are an expert on a subject that is really interesting, and I believe not just for me, but for anyone, not just for business analysts, but for any professional or any person who is living in the current days. That is complexity, right? And I have a question for starting this conversation: is how to be nimble in complex context. We have been talking about Nimble, this ability of an organization to sense and respond to change and doing it quickly and precisely. But if the world is so complex, how can an organization be nimble? Would you like to start talking about complexity and what does that mean?
Yes, I think that's probably a good place to start. And I think I'll use two ways. One is I love words, and I love to know where words come from. So the word complex, that word plex, it means braided or tangled together. And so if I contrast that with another word that sometimes we use these two interchangeably, but they actually mean very different things. So if I talk about something that is complicated, that word plick, it means folded, so it's almost like an origami fold that you can unfold. You can fully understand how it works, and then you can refold it. So it's something that you can figure out. So machines, for example, are complex, are complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Complex, that word, the plex, the entangled piece, so human systems, natural systems, they're all complex. They're interconnected in ways that we can't fully understand. Everything is connected to everything else, and that brings with it continuous change and uncertainty, basically. And so the second way that I like to describe this is with an analogy, and it's contrasting two different contexts. I like to say it's hard to survive in the jungle if you were trained in the zoo. And I find that kind of sometimes, brings it across, because it's very different to, in your language, be nimble when you're in a predictable environment. Although sometimes, if an organization is too much like a zoo, all of the bureaucracy and the structures actually keep us from being nimble. But other times, if we don't understand that we're in the jungle, then again, it's very difficult to be nimble, because we don't understand completely what we're dealing with. So I think I'll leave that there as what is complexity. We can obviously go deeper, but I think that gets the point across.
Let me bring an additional example that could be interesting to differentiate two other words, that's nimble and agile. So we usually say that agile is the ability to change direction quickly, right?
Mm.
And nimble is the ability to sense and respond to change also quickly. We even don't have two words for that in Portuguese. We just have one, ágil. But in English, they have two words. And if I think about a gymnastic, a person who does those very beautiful solo acrobacies into the Olympics, they're very agile. They can change their position in the air very quickly. But it's trained. It's a very sequence of movements that they train, and so they can be agile. That's very different from someone who's playing basketball or soccer, and they can train the movements, but they don't know what's going to happen with the other player that's in the other team. So that's a very complex environment. They have to sense and respond quickly, and that's a different way of a different ability, the nimbleness of mind that there's needed. And in a complex environment, you are not supposed to know what's going to happen next. So you you have to understand. So I even think about this, if this question makes a lot of sense, because in a complex content, how not to be nimble, right? And survive. Maybe that's
And I think part of the problem is that we tend to assume that we're not in complexity. It's over the last few decades, it's I guess it started with Taylorism, or with when we entered the world of big factories and things being automated, with industrialization. We were kind of seduced into this idea that we can make the world predictable, we can create order, and that we can, we live in a clockwork universe. That's almost how it's how we, if you just think of how we're schooled, most of us, when I went to school, it was mostly about giving right answers, about repeating back, the right answer that the teacher wanted to hear. It wasn't necessarily about thinking for myself or being nimble, I guess, in the classroom. And so we've created business contexts where we assume predictability. When you talk about nimbleness being the ability to kind of sense and respond to change, if you just think about how change typically is handled in large organizations, we try to manage change. I think that's a bit of an oxymoron. We try and manage change with very linear processes, with things like ADKAR and all of these the methodologies that almost assumes that change is predictable and we can manage it and we can control it. And I think if we really understand complexity, then we realize that you can't really control change, especially where people are involved, and also with where the world is at the moment. Change is becoming faster and more. So, by the time you've kind of managed one change, the next one is already upon you. And this is why I think people are starting to talk about change fatigue, et cetera, but change is just part of life. And so I think a big part of the problem is, why we, using your example, why we tend to lean towards agile and not towards nimbleness, is because for a very long time we've kind of assumed that we live in a complicated world, not a complex one. And that realization, I think, is dropping now, that we are always in complexity.
Let me bring Descartes to the table, and talking about the method. Something you said, like we're trying to deal with complexity using a method, and Descartes is a very machine way of thinking or understanding the world, and the method is usually trying to reduce the complexity. I would say complexity, probably it's the complicated stuff, into smaller pieces, and make small things that I could understand. And so I'm solving small pieces, and with that I will achieve the big picture, like building a machine, bring it into small pieces. But as you said, bringing to small pieces loses the connections or something more. So the method that we use it with Descartes is not very useful in a complex world. But if we're not reducing it to small pieces, how to deal with this complexity? How can we survive our mind? How can we organize our ways of working into this complex situation, complex context?
So I think maybe one place to start, and one thing to just say as well, is that not everything that we're dealing with is complex. So I believe we are always in complexity, especially when we are surrounded by other humans, in human systems, but not all of the decisions we need to make, or all of the tasks that we're dealing with, or the problems we need to solve are complex. So I think there are still many problems or tasks in an organization that are complicated or even simple, where we can reduce it to parts, use reductionist thinking, linear thinking, where we can analyze things and fully understand. Remember when we said complicatedness is about something that's folded, so we can unfold it and we can understand it. When something is truly complex, you kind of need to deal with both the parts and the whole of the system or the whole of the problem at the same time. And you really need to shift from thinking about the parts to thinking about how are things related. So what are the relationships between the parts? What is flowing? I really think that a very useful lens is the lens of flow, looking at things like the flow of value through an organization, the flow of information, the flow of even things that aren't so tangible, like the flow of trust, the flow, all of these different kinds of flows are really useful for us to look at. And then to think about, what is obstructing the flow, what is enabling the flow, what needs to be connected that isn't, what is close to what else, what is influencing what else. And then you also need to really make peace with this idea of emergence. There are, in a complicated system, so if you think of a car, the parts are connected in ways that's predictable. They don't suddenly, it's not, when the wheel connects to the chassis, all of a sudden, something else changes in another place in the car. But in a human system, if you just think, for example, about something like corruption, it's an emergent property, the same as culture in an organization. It emerges from all of the thousands of little interactions happening every day, everything that's tolerated, every interaction, even with the laws and the systems around us. And so there is this, if you want to fully understand it, you need to interact with the system. And even then, you're never going to fully understand it, but you'll get a sense of what it is that you need to be sensing and responding to. And it is a continuous process. You'll never completely figure it out. And I think this is why being nimble is actually such an important thing in complexity, because as you interact with the system, you will learn more about it. It will show itself in a way. But as you start acting in it, you'll change it. And so it's very much like a dance. I like to think, you're coming from Brazil. It's a bit like a tango. You have to be present. You have to, be continuously adapting to what's presenting itself. You can't analyze it from a distance and
I
think
like
that
it. And there's someone from LinkedIn saying flow, rhythm, cadence. I don't know who is on LinkedIn. Sorry, your name didn't appear here. If you can tell us your name, but I believe the same person said zoo and jungle are fun metaphors. Remind me of choices that parents make. Prepare the path for our children and prepare our children for the path.
Sure. Well, that's one of my very favorite poems. And now I can't remember the poet, but it'll come to me. But he says, traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking. And I think a key aspect of being nimble is also this ability to find our way, to not expect there to be a fully prepared path and to make that path. I think that's also a key aspect.
The first time I met you, Sonja, was in Lisbon last year, and I saw your presentation. And something that got very strong to me was this way of dealing with complexity and seeing complexity. And I realized that every time I saw the word complexity behind me, I also had this background music like tan 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 tan, something very scary. And I started to look for the word complexity. Every time I saw that, I put a new soundtrack in my mind. A kind of hope, a kind of fun, a kind of, oh, that's nice, that's complexity, that's complex, that's a lot of things that we can learn from that. And changing this way we deal with complexity, we see the word complexity, makes a very strong mindset shift in our mind, in our way of seeing it. Here, tango is complex. salsa is complicated. It's Robert Snyder. He's a really good dancer, by the way.
Okay. So I'll take his word for it.
Thank you, Robert.
Yes, I fully agree with you, Fabrizio, and that's a bit of a personal mission of mine to change how people relate to complexity, because it's a big frustration for me. And I think it comes from our language to a large extent. You must be familiar with all of these acronyms that's become so popular over the last few years. We've got VUCA, we've got Barney, and all of them, like Barney, it's they talk about brittle, it's brittle, anxious. I can never remember the N, it's incomprehensible is the I. But none of it is, they're not inviting words.
No.
And often usually when people mention the word complexity, it's in relation to a problem. So I've got a complex problem. They also talk about wicked problems. So we've kind of created, I think, in our minds, this link between complexity and something that is a problem, something that we want to eliminate, not want anything to do with. And so we've also almost have like an adversarial relationship with it. So when you see very often in magazines like Harvard Business Review and others, when they write about complexity, they would use verbs like taming complexity or simplifying complexity, or whatever you want to choose. And for me, complexity is life. Complexity is beautiful. Almost every system that you are part of, your family, your relationship with your wife, your relationship with your children, your extended family, any social event, if you go to a tango, for example, we go on holiday in the natural world. The ambiguity of good poetry, all of these things, they're examples of complexity. So to just frame complexity as a problem and something that we need to eliminate, I think, it strips it of its aliveness, of its beauty. And one way that I like to think about it is, if everything was complicated and everything was predictable, I just think the world would be boring. We could never have adventures because, everything would be certain. And so, yeah, I really agree with you. I think, and when I do work in organizations, very often I start with, working with the people and shifting the way that they see complexity. Because if they can see it as generative, a lot of our creativity comes from complexity. It comes from being in that uncertainty of being explorers and wayfinders. That's where creativity comes from. It's where our imaginations, kind of get, it can feed off of it. So trying to get rid of complexity is essentially getting rid of life.
And I like the point that you mentioned. It's important to deal with problems, and problems happens in different contexts, and the context is complex. So you have to deal with the problem, not with the context. The context is where you live, and it may be very beautiful. So you are dealing with a problem in a context world, and there's ways to do it. So I would like to bring some comments from the audience here, so you can comment on that. Robert said, I also hope we change our approach to VUCA. Let's solve VUCA, not surrender to it. Right? And I'm not even sure, Robert, if we should solve VUCA or if we just should embrace VUCA, because that's the world we live.
I think VUCA just is. And I think this is the thing is, we've made it into a problem. And I don't think that it actually is a problem. I think, another way to look at something that's complex that I find more useful, the moment you label something as a problem, you've got this urge to want to solve it. And many truly complex problems or challenges can't be permanently solved. And so I think it is more useful to think of complex challenges as patterns. Because remember, we spoke about emergence. So this is why something like root cause analysis and the 5 whys, all of these linear problem solving techniques that we're so used to, they don't really work in complexity, because we've got all of these interacting elements, all of these things that's in relationship to each other. And it's a rich relationship, so it's, if you think of in a human system, the fact that you and I are having this conversation and other people are listening in, it means that all of us in some way are changed, even if we don't even know who the people are that's listening. So there's a rich interrelationship happening here that doesn't happen in a machine. And so if we can think of these problems that we encounter in complex systems as patterns, immediately we've got multiple entry points. We can try different things and see what shifts, see what works. But if we think that we're going to linearly solve it, we're just almost immediately stuck. As if you think of something really complex, for example, like homelessness or poverty, and how it relates to things, even like mental health, addiction, food security, all of these, it's such a complex tangle that if you think that you can solve it like a linear problem, you're almost immediately stuck. If you can see it as a pattern with many interacting, elements where you can experiment and try different things, it means you're almost never stuck. And every time you try something, you learn more about the system, something changes, and it becomes, again, a dance. So I think we must dance with VUCA. I don't think we must try and solve it, because it's just, it is.
Complexity within music and dance is kind of richness, wealth, and luxury.
Not sure I know what that means, but
that's a comment. There's also a comment from our friend Thomas here, Thomas Martin. He said, you need to break down a complex problem in parts to solve it. You already spoke a little bit about that when you said that not all problems are complex. And he also says many people despair at complexity and struggle with defining where to start. Would you like to comment it?
Many of the complexity theorists will say, start where you are. There's no right place to start. And I think, if you take this out of a business context and you just think of any social structure like a family, or if you think about a natural system like a forest, I can't break that system into pieces. I can't break a forest into pieces and put it back together again without killing it. And it's the same with if I want to understand a team, or if I want to understand a family, trying to break it into its parts, it's not the same as taking apart a car. And so this is why you need to understand, you need to look at the whole, you need to look at the emergent whole, you need to understand how things are related. And then also what becomes a problem, if I look at a car, I can see that car in its entirety and I know where it starts and where it ends. If I look at a family, where does it start and where does it end? Do I look at the extended family? Do I look at friends? So it is in such an interconnected and rich environment. The moment you draw a boundary or you try and break it into pieces, you might just be leaving out the most important pieces because you didn't feel it was relevant. And I think this is why people feel a little bit at sea, because it does feel sometimes like you don't know where to start. But if you just start mapping what is flowing, what is related to what else, and what are some of the constraints at play in the system. There are, very often, especially if you look at the work, for example, of Dave Snowden, where, he's got multiple theories that looks at, the different constraints at play in a system, and constraints create patterns. And it gives you a bit of a foothold in terms of where can you start intervening. So you mentioned soccer or team sport in the, earlier. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple constraints at play. There's the rules of the game. There's the edges of the field. There's the weather system at the moment. Is the field wet or is it dry? Is it, there are all of these things that influence how the game can be played. And so if I want to change the game, and this is actually another really great analogy for a complex system. I don't know if you've come across the idea of an infinite game. I think it's Kars who wrote the book, The Infinite Game. And so there's a difference even between a game like soccer, where the rules are known, how to score is known, and the objective is to win. So even though the game itself might be complex, the environment is not necessarily complex.
Mm-hmm.
This is what Kars called an infinite game, where the purpose is to keep the game going. And the rules are continuously changing because the objective is not to win or lose, it's to keep the game going. And that is an entirely different context.
I like that, and that makes you sometimes the one who is creating the rules and adapting the rules so the game can continue, and the game probably should keep people happy, and that's really part of the game of life. And you mentioned the example of dealing with your family, dealing with my kids, and that's complex. And if you have teenagers at home and you think that as a problem, there's no solution for that unless you kill your son. That's a solution for a problem. That's not what he wants. So one thing that I'm listening to you and trying to understand is that complex situations are not to be solved; they are to be dealt with. So if I have a complex problem, I won't solve it. I should deal with it. I learn how to deal. And how can I deal with my son? I create restrictions, as you said. I can create some rules to put our life in some way that he and I could coexist in the same house and be happy together. I must understand and dance, as you said, make some moves, see what he does, sense his moves and try to bring to my own. So it's not a game with an end. Poverty, corruption, that's not a game with an end. Those things will never end. We just have to learn how to deal with it and creating some boundaries, trying to adjust the route, but it's every day and start where you are. I like those songs.
And I think, the thing is, within these complex problems, if we can call them that, there are aspects that's complicated or clear. There are aspects that we can solve.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing in its entirety, we dance with, we shift, and a key aspect, and this is why I like your idea of sense and respond, because one of the ways that we deal with complexity is to experiment, is to try different things and see what works. And if something works, you amplify it. If something doesn't work, you disrupt it or you dampen it. So it's an active involvement, and also sometimes what you need to do, some of the things are quite counterintuitive. This is something that I often encounter in organizations in an effort to be more agile. There's almost this continuous need to go faster. There's this, we need to be faster. And sometimes in complexity, you need to slow down. You need to slow down to really observe what is happening. Very often in organizations, what I see is somebody will come and they'll institute quite a big change. And then they don't give that change the opportunity to actually create the outcome that they were looking for before they do the next one. So you see this often with reorganizations. And so when you're really in a complex system, like when you're dealing with your teenager, you can't just, do one thing and then do the other thing. You need to, if you've put a new boundary in place, you need to watch for a while to see what happens. Is it working? Isn't it working? Tweak it. Don't just throw, do one change upon another change to try and go faster. Because very often this is what, we can go faster in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and that brings that idea from Thomas about breaking down the complex problem, or at least your changes, breaking down every change. So my kid, I may create some rules about clothes thrown away in the floor of the bathroom, and that's a very simple one, not a complex one. Just put your close in the right place, and let's use some time to deal with it. Let's see how he adapts to it, and don't hit him the next morning because he didn't follow the rule. There are some other comments here I would like you to comment on them. So Ben Hughes say, do you think men have more of a propensity to solve, or that pattern have solutions, or is it more complex than that?
I can see Ben asking that question. He's a friend of mine. I think it is more complex than that. Although what I do think is that many men have, in many cultures around the world, men have kind of been taught, that you don't show emotion, you have to have answers. If you're a leader, you have to know where you're going. So there's a decisiveness that I think men, or let's say it's kind of a masculine quality, that is very prevalent in the world. So I won't go as far as saying that men have more of a propensity in general, but I do think that there are narratives, and with those narratives, I guess, mental models that come with what does it mean, if you're young, to be a man, and then that translates also into what does it mean then to be a leader. But then at the same time, I think many women have also been enculturated to try and lead like men. And so I think this comes less with a gendered aspect than it comes with something that is a prevailing kind of a culture in the business world and in government. I think it's in leadership in general.
Some culture and expectations, let's say, so something that is expected and maybe more demanded or requested from men than from boys than girls, not necessarily natural. Okay, there's an interesting question from Thomas here. We talk about complexity mostly negatively, and you spoke about it. Are there any positive aspects about it? Would you like to bring some examples? You already mentioned some of complex relations that are very positive, like family or stuff like that. But bringing complexity, let's say I want to bring complexity for my company. That would be counterintuitive. Would that be a good idea?
One of my friends on LinkedIn, Frank Spencer, he said the other day, if you look at the natural world, increasing complexity means increasing maturity. So as an ecosystem or an organism matures, it becomes more complex. And so I think that's one way to look at it. For me, it's almost difficult to answer that question, because every system that is alive, anything that is alive, an organism, an ecosystem, a family, any living system is complex. And so to a large extent, complexity is our natural habitat. It's the family you grew up in is complex. Your body is a complex system. So one example of a good complex system would be your immune system. Your immune system is complex. You couldn't be in the world without that immune system. More and more, we're learning how complex our bodies actually are. If we're not really one organism, we're almost more like a symbiote. If you look at the gut biome, all of these things where we are complexity. Consciousness is a complex, an emergent property. We still don't really understand consciousness. We know that it doesn't reside in your head. It's embodied and extended. So anything that's alive is complex. And the moment we try and break it into pieces, or the moment we try to make it fit our linear way of thinking, we almost deanimate it. And so I think, and this is where we started a little bit, Fabrizio, is for some reason, the word complexity has almost become synonymous with problem. Like I don't ever hear people say, oh, wow, it's complex. I hear them say, oh, whatever expletive you want to use, it's complex. And so we are always in I always want to say an away state from the complexity. It's like we need to defend ourselves against it. And that is like defending yourself against life. So, yeah, that's how
I'm thinking about some situations I have seen in some companies that they don't use this word of creating complexity, but I think that's what they are doing in a positive way, is when an organization is looking for different people into their, when I say different people, people from different colors, different genders, different areas, different countries, different languages, to join their organization and bring some complexity to their organization, so they are more able to sense and respond to the complexity that's in the environment. So if an organization is not complex enough, it won't be able to deal with complexity. If I just have an organization, and let's use my organization, IBA is in the top of our head here. If IBA is in the International Institute of Business Analysis, if this organization just have employees from the same country, how can they be international? How can they understand the differences that we have in Brazil, you have in South Africa, people have in Asia or Australia? They must bring complexity to their body of employees and to their culture, and so they can deal with complexity. Looking for an organization in the lens of a culture, corporate culture, and not just process, rules, systems, and org charts. That's a way of bringing complexity to the table in a positive way, I understand.
No, definitely. I think, so there is this principle that you need complexity to meet complexity. I think it was Stanley McChrystal in his book also said, in Team of Teams, he said you need a network to counter a network. So it's this idea of requisite diversity. And I agree, it does introduce more complexity. The moment you bring more diversity in, there's more difference. And that difference can be generative. I think that's where a lot of innovation, for example, comes from, is all of this difference kind of rubbing up against each other. But again, I don't know about in Brazil, but definitely in South Africa, we've made the idea of diversity a problem to solve. Whereas if you look at it the way that we're looking at it now, if we're looking at it as, from a complexity perspective, diversity is a strategic asset to nurture. So in an ecosystem, if there's not enough diversity, then the system, it doesn't have resilience. And the same is true in a human system. If we all think the same and the context around us shifts, then, we have what's colloquially called a Kodak moment, because we don't have that ability to be nimble when things change. And so, yes, I agree with you that diversity in an organization, but also in a country, like South Africa, we are extremely diverse. We've got, 11 languages. And there's a beauty and a strength in that diversity. But sometimes, because it's difficult to be with and to work with people who are different to us, we start seeing that as a problem, not as a strength.
Yeah, I can see that. And sometimes complexity is misunderstood as a problem, as you said before, and not as a strength. And it should be understood as a strength as well. Not just, but as well. Let me bring some more comments from people who I hadn't bring comments before, so you can comment on the comments. Right? Agreed, it's about revisiting the situation, reevaluating, and then action, sense, and respond. And timelines are important. Give the change a bit of hope, as you said, waiting to see what happens after the change that you I think. Not sure if you want to add something to that, because that's commentary.
I just also want to acknowledge, that, even with this message that we shouldn't always frame complexity as a problem, I don't want to deny that it can be quite anxiety provoking. Mm-hmm. Because it's continuously changing. It's hard to make sense of it. It's, and sometimes it Like, for example, if you're losing market share, if you're a large organization losing market share and you can't really get to the bottom of these complex market dynamics, it can create anxiety and almost a sense of urgency to try and solve it. And very often what happens then is the things we do end up making things worse. But then also this idea of giving change some rope, I think sometimes it can be very difficult in a business context. Again, with this narrative that leaders have to be decisive, it can be very, very difficult to sit back and allow something to play out, because very often people would look at that and say, why are you so passive? Why aren't you being the decisive leader? So this is unfortunately very often what we see, is that leaders who are naturally good in complexity sometimes don't survive in large organizations because they do things that's counter to, what I guess we're taught in MBAs a good leader should do. So giving things time, slowing things down, it's quite countercultural in many organizations.
Great. There's a nice comment from Thomas here. Early humans were in a similar situation. They didn't understand scientifically what was going on around them. So what did they do? They invented God and religion to get some guidance and hope in all the crazy world. Maybe that's what we also need: clarity, vision on the future we want to have, and start shaping it, rather than despairing at the current complexity. And he brings this way of dealing with complexity with vision, not exactly an algorithm to solve a problem. It's a vision, some clarity, a vision on the future, what religions bring, and what a lot of organizations do as well: create a vision, a shared vision, not path, vision, and try to learn the path step by step. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think where we are now, we need to acknowledge the current complexity, but not get despondent about it. Acknowledge where we are. And I think one of the things that links a little bit to what he was saying is, I think we need to shift from having very direct goals and expecting particular outcomes to having a sense of direction. And I think that's where vision comes in. It's, yes, this is where we are now. Acknowledge where we are now, what is possible from here and what isn't. What direction do we want to go into? What is that future vision? And then to help us, with the wayfinding, because, and this is why I think constraint or boundaries in a human system is important, because I don't know about you, but I don't know if you've ever tried to paint, for example, but having that completely blank canvas in front of you can be quite, there's just so many options. It's like a menu in a restaurant with too many options. The moment we can create some boundaries, it makes it safer for us to explore. It's even, it's even young children, you'll see, if they know where the boundaries are, they feel safer. So one of the things that I've been working on is a framework I call the Waysfinding that helps us do these things. And I think some of the role that religion has played, as he said as well, is it does provide a vision to some extent, but what it really does provide are guardrails. It provides boundaries in terms of what is right, what is wrong, what can you do, what can't you do. And I think some religions, take that too far. But if you can acknowledge where you are, where are we now? What is possible from where we are now? Where do we want to go? What is that direction that we want to head into? Where can't we go? So where are there limits or things that we just can't do anything about? So these could be laws. It could be, whatever. It's just something, these are constraints we have to work within. So going back to your soccer analogy, we have to stay within the field, and we have to play by the rules. That is the limit. But then on the other side of this, to kind of almost create a cone of possibility, if you want to call it that, where do we choose not to go? Because if we make it too broad, then we scatter our focus. Who do we choose to be as we're moving? This creates a field of potential that we can explore, and where we can experiment, and where we can move forwards into the uncertainty. And for me, that is a key way to look at complex problems. It's not like planning a business trip. So I want to get to a particular point, to Lisbon. I can book the flights, everything is known. This is more like a journey of exploration. I know where I am and I know the direction I want to head in. I know where I can't go and I know where I don't want to go. But within that, I'm experimenting. I'm dancing with the system. I'm seeing what emerges. And that to me is a way, for example, to move strategically as well in a complex environment. It's through strategic wayfinding.
Right, and that's a different way of defining strategy, because not defining specific goals and objectives and measurable objectives, but specifying a direction, putting some guardrails or some constraints, as you said. But I can't do what I don't want to do, but giving this space for experimentation and for adaptation. Very interesting. Let me bring some more comments. Suzette, that personally in complex situations, they oversimplify situations and often might appear to address the complexity, but really leave significant blind spots. But they present to other men, and if you are a persuasive man, then other men buy it. Selling a solution for a complex problem where the solution might not exist.
Yeah, I think we are drawn to simplicity, unfortunately, and I don't think it's only I don't think it's gendered. But we typically I think also because we've got this bias to action and this need to solve things. We tend to, as she says, oversimplify. We make things simplistic. So there's actually a simplicity within the complexity if you're able to just be with the complexity, because we're dealing with patterns and it's something that we all know how to be in complexity because we grew up in a complex family. We've always been in complexity. It's just when we come into the workplace that all of a sudden we imagine ourselves to be in this wonderfully predictable, ordered world that's more like a machine than a living system. And so we do in many contexts, and also because the things that we are taught, when you do an MBA, for example, the things that you're taught as best practice, when you apply those very often in complexity, that's when you get yourself in trouble, because many of those things are more suited to complicated or ordered environments. So yes, I agree that it happens. I just don't think that it's a gendered thing.
And sometimes I believe that simplicity is a kind of a dream, that people love simplicity. And so for every complex problem, there's a simple answer that just don't worth it and don't solve anything. But it's so easy to sell. So people are looking for those medicines that cure everything, the elixir, something that can solve all the problems of your life. And that's so simple. Oh, why didn't I get it before? Because it doesn't exist. But there are people selling those kind of untruth medicines for solving every problem's life.
Yeah, and I think it's there's this saying in the business world that nobody's been fired for hiring McKinsey. And I think you can substitute McKinsey with many other of these large consulting companies. That might have changed now a little bit, but it is because to some extent, they are selling answers. They are selling solutions. They are selling simplicity. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, Fabrizio, we all like certainty. It makes us feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Humans, we organize for comfort. We optimize for comfort. We like to be comfortable. And we what makes us comfortable are things like certainty, predictability, feeling in control. I think we all like to feel in control, having clarity. And then I would almost add to that convenience. If you look at, just the world at the moment, we can, I can pick up my phone now, order groceries or order takeout. In 30 minutes, it's delivered. I can go onto Netflix and watch anything that I want to watch. I can binge watch the entire series. Not like when I grew up, you kind of had to wait for every Friday. So we optimize for those things. And so somebody that comes and says, I can guarantee you an outcome. I can change your culture for you. I can install Agile. I can do, and what all of these, we want to believe it. And so we go for it. We don't like the answer that says, you know what, I can partner with you, and we can kind of, try different things, see what works, evolve together, co-create something, almost like fit for context, agility or nimbleness, whatever you want to call it. It's not the easy, I'll just come in and train all your people and install whatever it is that you're looking for. So yes, it happens.
And people are sometimes naive in buying something that's not real, but it have a good sales pitch, as what's her name, Suzette spoke, right? So people like the simple solution for complex problem, despite they don't exist. And here you are saying, oh, you must understand, instead of solving complexity, learn how to live in that pattern, observe the patterns, understand how it is, deal with it, create some boundaries, bring a vision. I believe you even answered my starting question, which was not a very easy one, how to be nimble in complex contexts. You brought some very interesting answers for that. Let me see, we have some more questions. I'm not bringing all the questions and comments for this chat because we don't have time for that, but contact moment to said about those moments that matter, bringing joy and beauty to stakeholders. That was your point.
I guess that's one way to look at it. But the colloquial meaning to a Kodak moment is a little bit similar to what happened to the dinosaurs. They kind of
Kodak the company, not
yes,
Kodak the picture.
Kodak the company. Kodak. It's when you become complacent and you become almost a little bit arrogant, you feel that everything, it's overconfident to some extent, and the context shifts. And to your point, for Fabrizio, you don't have enough diverse perspectives, people who can see this coming and who can kind of adapt. Then very often the company as a whole becomes irrelevant and collapses. The same thing happened to Nokia.
Yeah, you must be nimble to survive, and you must to deal with complexity to be nimble. Okay, good. Boundaries, another important culture trait in dance. So using dance again as a metaphor. Did Johnny Castle, Patrick say, this is my dance space, this is your dance space. So quoting Dirty Dancing, right?
One of my favorite movies. I'm not going to tell you how many times I've watched it. I'm a bit embarrassed to say. What can I say?
Would you say that movement is complex or complicated? Probably complicated. You can train for that, right? Perfect. I would like to call an ending for this session, and would like to hear from you what points that maybe you didn't have the chance, or I didn't ask you for that, but there are important points about complexity you think it's important for us to take us some takeaways from this session today.
I think, if I have to summarize what it takes to be nimble in complex contexts, I think it requires a workforce as well as an organization that is what we call fit for complexity. You'll see that, my company's name is ComplexityFit. And what we mean by fitness is it's an ecological term. It's the ability to be at ease in a particular context or in a natural system, in a niche. It's almost the way that a leopard is at ease in the bush. A bird is at ease in the forest. And I think that is, we need to, in a way, reskill our people to see complexity differently, and even more tangible, to relate differently to change. Because complexity comes with change. And in many organizations, there's almost a resistance to change. And I think to a large extent, because just like complexity, people have a relationship with change that's not generative. So I think to start with, how do we create a workforce that's complexity fit? What are the skills they need? What are the habits of mind they need? And then from an organizational perspective, what do we need to change in the way that we're structured? What do we need to change in the way that we measure success, the targets we set? If there's one thing that keeps an organization from being nimble and that creates unintended consequences, it's what we choose to measure. So I think this focus on what does it mean to be complexity or change fit is a really interesting one. And then one last thing I'll leave you with is, in answer to that question, to some extent, we looked at what enabled us to be fit when we found ourselves in really complex, novel contexts. And we created an acronym, that we talk about being cool in complexity. And so cool is an acronym for, let's call them 4 habits of mind. The first is courage. Sometimes it needs courage to go into the unknown. It needs courage to let go of, all of the things that we think are best practices. Openness is the first O. Openness to diverse perspectives. Openness to learning and unlearning. Openness to curiosity. Openness to, bring our imagination and to things, to just acknowledging what is there. The second O is for observing. Observing has 2 parts. One is observing yourself. Like, when am I triggered? When do I feel anxious when things are complex and I can't really understand? Can I take a step back, take a pause, take a deep breath, and choose how I want to respond and not just go into a knee-jerk reaction? That's the one side. The other side is observing the context. What is going on around me? Am I situationally aware? What is changing? What is staying the same? What is the pattern? And then the L is for lightness. And lightness is the most important one. If I would start with lightness, but then it wouldn't spell cool anymore, and then I'm but lightness is this ability to not take yourself too seriously, to try different things, and to fail and learn from the failure, to play, really play, not just say we're playing with the numbers or we're playing with strategy, but really play. Bring your curiosity, bring your imagination, see the beauty that is in the complexity, even when it's a problem. I think we have too little lightness in our organizations, and I think that is why so many people are very close to burnout, because everything is so serious, and everything we forget to just bring our humanity to the workplace. So I'll leave you with that one. Be cool when you encounter complexity, and I hope that was useful.
I guess we have a very light conversation about complexity, so it was very cool to speak with you. Just before ending, last minute, if people want to find you, you told us about your organization. What's the address where they can find you?
So they can connect with me on LinkedIn. I also blog on Medium. And then they can go to www.ComplexityFit.com.
Okay, I will put those addresses on the description of this video for those who are not watching us live but recorded, so it's going to be even easier for them to connect. So now, thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to have you here. I learned so much, and I hope everyone who joined us have learned it as well. And I hope to see you soon again.
Thank you, and ditto.
Yes, it was a really cool conversation. Bye-bye, folks. Thank you for the comments in the chat. See you next week.